My name is Simone Doyle. I'm 34, and I own 6 bakeries across the Twin Cities, which means I've spent the last decade learning something most people never have to learn: how a commercial lease actually works, who really holds the power in a landlord tenant relationship, and exactly what a 30-day notice can do to a business that thought it had more time. So when my family called me on a Sunday night, begging me to help save the restaurant that had refused to invest a single dollar in my dream 12 years earlier, I already knew 2 things. I knew exactly which document was sitting in my own filing cabinet with their address on it. And I had no idea yet that I was about to sit across a table from my own father and let him beg a landlord he didn't know was his daughter. Welcome back to her final chapter, where every story starts with silence and ends with power. If you've ever built something on your own, only to be asked for help by the people who once told you it wasn't real, this one's for you. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. I grew up in the back of my family's restaurant, the Rosemary Table, on the corner of a strip in St. Paul. My grandfather bought in 1974, and my father inherited outright 20 years later. I learned to fold dough before I learned to ride a bike, standing on a milk crate beside my grandmother Anna at the prep counter, flour to my elbows, while my father ran the front of house and my brother Connor, 4 years older, learned the books. I have always understood food as architecture: proportions, timing, structure, and I've spent the last 12 years applying that same understanding to buildings themselves. After culinary school, I worked 2 years as a pastry chef before I discovered the part of the business nobody in my family had ever cared about: real estate. My first bakery, a 900 square foot storefront in Highland Park, came with a lease I negotiated myself after reading every clause 3 times, catching a rent escalation buried on page 11 that would have doubled my costs by year 3. I learned, slowly and then very quickly, that the person who owns the building always outlasts the person who only rents the dream inside it. By 29, I'd started buying small commercial properties myself, one at a time, through a holding company I keep entirely separate from the bakery brand, because I learned early that landlords and business owners get treated very differently in every negotiation, and I wanted to be taken seriously as both. My quirk, if you can call it that, is that I still keep a printed folder, not digital, paper, 3-ring binder, labeled simply leases, with every property I own tabbed by address, because I don't trust a spreadsheet to make me actually read the fine print the way flipping physical pages does. My property manager, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Renata, teases me about it constantly. It's the same habit that would end up mattering more than either of us understood, the week my family called asking for help I didn't yet know I was already involved in. The call came on a Sunday evening in October, my mother's voice doing the thing it always does right before an ask. Warm, a little too bright, circling the actual point like a plane that hasn't been cleared to land. "Simone, honey, we need to talk to you about the restaurant. Things have gotten complicated." Complicated turned out to mean the Rosemary Table was 3 months behind on rent, facing an eviction notice from a new commercial landlord who'd bought the strip mall the year before, and my father had exhausted every line of credit he had left trying to cover it. My mother's voice cracked on the word evicted, and beneath the crack I heard the sentence I'd been hearing my entire adult life, dressed up now as a plea instead of a dismissal. "This is a family business, Simone. It's been in this family for 50 years. You understand business now. We thought maybe you could talk to the landlord, help us figure something out. This is a family business." She'd said some version of that sentence to me 12 years earlier, the week I'd asked to borrow $4,000 against the restaurant's line of credit to open my first bakery. My father had said it too, standing in the same kitchen where I'd learned to fold dough. "This is a family business, Simone, not a hobby. We can't risk what your grandfather built on something that might not pan out." I'd built Larkspur Bakeries anyway, on $8,000 of my own catering savings, and 11 months of 18-hour days. Nobody in my family had ever once asked how I'd done it. They'd only ever mentioned it briefly, when it became useful to bring up at holidays. I told my mother I'd look into it. I did not yet understand exactly how deeply I already had. To understand why that phone call landed the way it did, you have to go back 12 years, to the spring I sat at my parents' kitchen table with a business plan I'd spent 4 months building, asking for a fraction of what the restaurant's credit line could have covered. I had comparable sales data from 3 similar bakeries in the metro area. I had a lease already negotiated, contingent only on the deposit. I had a 5-year revenue projection I'd built with an actual accountant, not a guess scribbled on a napkin. My father read exactly 2 pages of it before sliding it back across the table. Connor's been groomed to take this place over since he was 14. You want to go start something new? That's fine, Simone, but you don't get to risk what he's inheriting to do it. My mother, standing at the stove, added the detail that stung the longest. You've always been the creative one, that's wonderful. But creative doesn't pay a mortgage, sweetheart. Connor understands the business side. Maybe if you'd focused more on that instead of your little pastry experiments, we'd feel differently. I want to be fair to them, in the way I've learned to be fair to difficult tenants over the years, understanding a decision without excusing it. My father had inherited a restaurant that was, at the time, barely breaking even, carrying debt from an expansion my grandfather had made in the 90s. He was scared, and scared people protect what's directly in front of them, even at the cost of what's standing a little further away, asking quietly for a chance. I understand that now. I didn't understand it then, sitting at that table, watching my own business plan get folded shut like something that had embarrassed the room. I left that kitchen and started Larkspur with $8,000 I'd saved from 3 years of freelance catering, a rented commercial kitchen space I split with 2 other small vendors, and a determination that had very little to do with proving anyone wrong, and everything to do with simply refusing to disappear the way that folded business plan had. By year 3, I had 2 locations. By year 7, 5. My family came to my grand openings, mentioned Larkspur politely to their friends, and never once, in 12 years, asked me a single detailed question about how any of it actually worked. Here's the part I don't say out loud very often. Some quiet, stubborn part of me still wanted them to ask. Every ribbon cutting, every feature in a local business magazine, I found myself watching my father's face for something that looked like real curiosity instead of polite acknowledgement. I told myself I'd built Larkspur entirely for me. That was mostly true. The part that wasn't true is the part I'm telling you now. My best friend and general manager, Priya, who's watched 12 years of this pattern from close range, did not mince words when I told her about the phone call. Sim, they didn't want your help when it cost them nothing to give you a fraction of it. Now they want your help because it's their turn to need something. Those aren't the same kind of asking, and you know it. I told her she was right, and I looked into it anyway because grief and old hope wear the same clothes sometimes, and some small unfinished part of me still wanted to be the daughter who saved the thing they'd once decided wasn't worth risking on me. I asked my mother to send me the eviction notice, telling myself I was simply gathering facts before deciding how or whether to get involved. The document arrived by email 2 days later, a PDF of a formal notice from a property management firm called Amber Row Holdings, citing $1,400 in unpaid rent and a 30-day cure period before formal eviction proceedings would begin. I read it once, quickly, the way you read something that hasn't fully registered yet. Then I read the address at the top a second time, and a third, and the floor of my own office seemed to tilt slightly beneath me. Stay with me, because what I found when I opened my own 3-ring binder that evening, I still have trouble describing without my hands going a little cold. Amber Row Holdings was not a stranger's company. It was mine, a holding entity I'd formed 4 years earlier to acquire a small portfolio of aging commercial properties across St. Paul, managed day-to-day by Renata under standing instructions to handle lease enforcement without escalating every routine matter to me personally, because I owned 11 buildings by then and had learned, the hard way, that a landlord who reviews every late payment personally never has time to run a bakery chain on top of it. 2 years earlier, Amber Row had purchased a small strip mall on the corner of a street in St. Paul I hadn't visited in exactly that long, because I'd stopped attending Sunday dinners after a disagreement with my mother the previous spring. I had never once looked closely at the tenant roster. I had never had a reason to. Now, sitting at my kitchen table with the eviction notice open on my laptop and my own company's letterhead staring back at me, I understood, with a clarity that made my stomach drop entirely, that I was already my family's landlord, and neither side of this had known it until exactly this moment. I want to tell you what happened over the following week before I tell you what happened at the family meeting, because both things were unfolding at once, and I didn't fully decide how to handle it until I was already standing in the restaurant's dining room. I called Renata first, my voice steadier than I felt. She confirmed everything without hesitation, pulling the file while we spoke. Rosemary Table LLC signed a 5-year lease with the previous owner 8 years ago. We acquired the building in the portfolio purchase 2 years back. And yes, 3 months behind. Standard notice sent per the lease terms. Do you want me to pause the process? I told her to hold everything for now. I hadn't decided yet what I wanted to do, only that I needed to see this in person before I did anything at all. My mother called again 2 days later, this time with an actual plan attached to her voice, the particular brisk efficiency she reserves for moments she believes she's finally found the solution. We're having everyone over Thursday. Dad, Connor, even your Aunt Ruth, since she helped with the original loan on the building years ago. We want to sit down together, figure out how to approach the landlord. Maybe you could look at the lease terms since you understand this kind of thing now. I agreed to come. I did not tell her, over the phone, exactly how well I already understood the lease terms. Thursday evening, I walked into the Rosemary Table's dining room, closed for the private meeting, and found not the small family conversation my mother had described, but nearly a dozen people gathered around two pushed-together tables. My parents, Connor, Aunt Ruth, a business consultant my father had apparently hired on credit he didn't have, two of the restaurant's longtime line cooks worried about their jobs, and my cousin Devin, who I hadn't spoken to in 3 years, apparently there to offer moral support. Just the family, to talk things through, my mother had promised. I counted 11 people who weren't me and understood, walking in, that this had never been a conversation. It was a pitch, and I was the only investor in the room. The physical details landed before anyone said a word. My father's chef coat, the same style he'd worn my entire childhood, had gone thin at the elbows, a small hole starting near the cuff he'd clearly meant to mend and hadn't. Behind the bar, a brand-new espresso machine sat gleaming, still bearing a financing sticker from a restaurant supply company, purchased, I'd learn within the hour, on a payment plan they could no longer afford, an attempt to look more modern for customers while the actual rent went unpaid 3 months running. Performed renewal on top of quiet collapse, the exact contrast I'd learned to spot in a decade of walking into struggling tenants' storefronts. The consultant, a brisk man named Phil, who my father introduced with obvious relief, opened a laptop and began outlining a path forward that involved, among other things, Simone providing a $5,000 bridge loan personally guaranteed against Larkspur's assets. I said nothing yet. I was doing the math I always do walking into a property, quietly, behind a calm expression. The small comments started almost immediately, the way they always do in my family, dressed as gratitude that curdled fast into expectation. Aunt Ruth squeezed my hand and said, "Well, aren't you the success story now? Must be nice having money to throw around while the rest of us actually built something real together." I had built 6 locations and 11 properties from $8,000 and a folded business plan. I said nothing. Connor, standing near the register, added his own brick without quite meeting my eyes. Must be nice to swoop in and be the hero now, after 12 years of doing your own thing. My cousin Devin, drifting past with a plate of comped appetizers, muttered, "Guess baking pays better than we thought," loud enough for the whole table to hear and laugh softly at. My mother, an hour in, delivered the second phrase, aimed directly at me now, in front of 11 witnesses. "This is a family business, Simone. It's what your grandfather built. We know you understand that better than anyone now that you've got your own. We just need you to remember what family actually means when it matters." Phil the consultant finished his presentation and looked at me expectantly, the way people look at the person they've already decided is the answer. My father cleared his throat and said what I now understood the entire evening had been building toward. "Simone, we need $50,000 by the end of the month, or we lose this place. This is a family business. You owe it that much." Third delivery. Not softened this time by any pretense of a conversation. Just the invoice, laid bare, in front of a room I hadn't been told would be this large. I let the silence sit. 1 second. 3. 5 full seconds in a dining room where 11 people waited for the daughter who'd finally made something of herself to write the check they'd assumed, from the moment they saw my bakery's names in a magazine, would someday be available to them. "I don't owe this restaurant anything," I said finally, quiet, level. "I built my own business without a single dollar from this family. I'm not writing a check tonight." My father's face went red, and he started to say something about ingratitude, about everything they'd given me growing up, and I let him get about halfway through it before I reached into my bag and set my own folder on the table, the same 3-ring binder Renata teases me about, open to a single tabbed page. "Before this goes any further," I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it before anyone says another word about what I owe this business." I turned the page toward my father. The eviction notice you got 3 weeks ago came from a company called Amber Row Holdings. I own Amber Row Holdings. I have owned this building through that company for 2 years. I didn't know you were the tenant until I read the notice myself last week. The room went entirely silent. My father stared at the page, at the letterhead he'd clearly memorized out of dread over the past 3 weeks, now sitting inches from his own daughter's hand. That's not possible, my mother said. We would have known. Someone would have told us. Nobody told you because I didn't know either, I said. My property manager handles routine notices without escalating them to me personally. I own 11 buildings, Mom. I don't review every late tenant by name. I found out you were behind on rent to a company I own the same way you found out you were behind, from a printed notice. Phil, the consultant, tried once, reaching for his laptop like the numbers there might argue the situation back into a shape he understood. There has to be some kind of conflict of interest here, some obligation. I shook my head. There's a lease, and it has terms, and those terms exist whether or not the landlord happens to share a last name with the tenant. I've evicted stranger tenants for less than 3 months behind. The lease doesn't care who's sitting at this table. Connor tried second, standing up too fast, his chair scraping. So what? You're just going to throw us out? Your own family's restaurant? I looked at him steady. I haven't decided what I'm going to do as a landlord yet. What I've decided is that I'm not paying $50,000 as a daughter who's still trying to earn a seat at a table that told her 12 years ago she wasn't worth the risk. My mother reached for the same old line one final time, softer now, closer to pleading. This is a family business, Simone. But a sentence loses its teeth the third time it fails in the same room, and this time it landed exactly as what it had always been. A claim on my loyalty from people who'd never once extended the same loyalty to my dream when it was small enough to still need protecting. I want to be clear about what happened next, because I know some of you watching this expected me to walk out and let the building sit empty out of spite, and that was never who I wanted to be, even sitting in that room. What I did instead, over the following 2 weeks, was exactly what I would have done for any struggling tenant I believed could actually recover. I had Renata draw up a restructured lease, extending the cure period, converting the back rent into a manageable payment plan at standard commercial terms, no forgiveness, no gift, just fair structure instead of a cliff. I told my father plainly that Larkspur's money was never going to bail out a business decision I'd had no part in making, but that Amber Row Holdings would treat the Rosemary table exactly as fairly and exactly as firmly as it treated every other tenant on that strip. My father did not thank me warmly. What he did, 3 weeks later, standing in the restaurant's kitchen while I came by to walk the property with Renata, was something quieter and, I think, more honest. He watched me review the lease terms with my property manager, watched me speak with an authority he'd never once seen in me at that same kitchen table 12 years earlier, and he said, almost to himself, I read your business plan wrong. I read all of it wrong. It wasn't an apology exactly. It was the first time in 12 years he'd acknowledged, out loud, that there had ever been a plan worth reading in the first place. The quieter thing happened a week after that, when I finally let myself walk into the restaurant's old dry storage room, the one that used to be my grandmother Anna's domain, and found, tucked on a high shelf behind boxes nobody had touched in years, her recipe box, index cards in her looping handwriting, flour stained at the corners, recipes I'd learned standing on a milk crate before I understood any of this would matter someday. My mother found me there, sitting on an overturned bucket with the box open in my lap, and instead of saying anything about the restaurant or the money, she sat down on the floor beside me and asked me to tell her about my grandmother's croissant recipe, the one I still use, slightly adapted, in all 6 of my bakeries. It wasn't a resolution. It was the first real conversation we'd had in 12 years that had nothing to do with what either of us needed from the other. What I learned, standing in a dining room where my own family tried to invoice me for a dream they'd once refused to fund, is that you can inherit a building. You can inherit 50 years of a family name over a doorway. Nobody can inherit belonging on your behalf, and nobody can buy their way into deserving you after the fact, no matter whose name ends up on the lease. Sometimes the only thing that actually changes a family is the quiet, unglamorous fact of who finally holds the paperwork. That's my story. If it meant something to you, drop a comment and tell me. I read every one. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe to her final chapter, because there's another one waiting for you next week.